This is the second part of Chapter 3 of Charles Bettelheim's class struggle in the USSR, the third period. What's it? I always forget the title. 1930 to 1941, Part 1: The Dominated. Chapter 3 is titled The Kolkhoz System, and this section of it, which is Section 2, is titled The Kolkhoz. So here we go. A. Relationships of production and domination within the kolkhoz. The kolkhoz, which emerged from, quote, collectivization from above, end quote, was characterized by the existence within it of a marked hierarchical structure. A small number of managers allocated the direct workers and means of work to definite tasks, parenthesis, and the latter in principle corresponded to orders coming from organizations placed, quote, above, end quote, the kolkhoz, end parenthesis. The direct producers were thus reduced to the role of simple executants, put at the lower level of a structure in which certain features of the capitalist organization of labor were combined with military command forms. This encouraged the reproduction of a particular type of agrarian despotism. The direct producers were thus reduced to the role of simple executants, put at the lower level of a structure in which certain features of the capitalist organization of labor were combined with military command forms. This encouraged the reproduction of a particular type of agrarian despotism. In the given ideological and political conditions, this structure was adequate for the extraction of a surplus, which was especially high. The great majority of the lower kolkhozniks were entrusted mainly with work that was manual and unskilled, and among them women were the majority. Footnote: the unbalanced sex ratio in the active kolkhoz population was largely due to the substantial rural emigration. To the benefit of industrialization, many men left for the towns in search of higher pay. It was also partly due to the deportations, which affected more men than women. End footnote. They had particularly small incomes, being at the lowest income level, parenthesis, excluding labor camp workers, end parenthesis. In addition, kolkhozniks did not have the same rights as other Soviet citizens. One might say that the kolkhoz population, quote, had only duties, end quote, towards the managing organs of the kolkhoz and toward the state which, so far as the kolkhoz population was concerned, quote, had only rights, end quote. Various authorities took upon themselves the power to take back from the lower kolkhoznik one or another material advantage which had been originally officially recognized as the kolkhozniks in writing, and in practice the kolkhoznik could not protest. If the kolkhoznik did, it would bring that kolkhoznik more trouble than protesting was worth. To justify their behavior, the authorities did not hesitate to claim that, quote, what is good for the state, parenthesis, or the kolkhoz, end parenthesis, is good for the kolkhoznik, end quote. Footnote. Some articles in Russian. End footnote. For example, this novelist Stadnyuk, Stadnyuk, could not put the following words in the mouth of the party official. Quote, with us, there is no difference between the interest of the kolkhozniks and the interest of the state in general. If the state takes gain to satisfy some need or other, the satisfying of this need is equally in the interest of the peasants. End quote. Stadnyuk. I don't know if my internet will work. I'm outside, but it just says that he was a Ukrainian writer who lived from 1920 to 1994. Back to the text. In fact, by reason of the very overexploitation that the kolkhozniks endured, the kolkhozniks were, quote, sub-citizens, end quote, to impart of the rights, quote, recognized by the Constitution, end quote, and which were hardly respected for other citizens, were quite simply denied. In fact, by reason of the very overexploitation that the kolkhozniks endured, the kolkhozniks were, quote, sub-citizens, end quote, to impart of the rights, quote, recognized by the Constitution, end quote, and which were hardly respected for other citizens, were quite simply denied. Thus the kolkhozniks were economically and juridically discriminated against, although Article 123 of the Constitution forbade any discrimination between different citizens. Heading 1. Working conditions of the kolkhozniks. At the center of the discrimination which affected ordinary kolkhozniks were, obviously, their working conditions. These conditions were fixed in a mainly arbitrary way by the administrative organs of the kolkhoz. By decisions of these organs, each kolkhoznik, offering himself for manual labor, was placed under the authority of a brigadier. The brigadier assigned his daily tasks and fixed the time limit in which those tasks had to be done. Part of these tasks corresponded to, quote, norms, fixed in advance by the, quote, technical services, unquote. Ordinary kolkhozniks had control neither of the way in which these norms were fixed nor the way authorities evaluated the, quote, success rate, end quote, with which the kolkhozniks had accomplished the imposed norms. However, it was on the basis of such norms and such evaluations that the remuneration of each kolkhoznik was fixed. From 1933, the central authorities multiplied the norms. For example, a law of February 28, 1933, fixed 35 norms for fieldwork. In 1934, new tasks were, quote, normed. In 1940, 254 tasks had norms, end quote. These, I don't know where the start of that quote was from. I don't know, there's an end quote without an initial quote. So, in 1934, new tasks were, quote, normed. In 1940, 254 tasks had norms. Footnote. See the article by Sofroshkin and Chuvikov, something in Russian. End footnote. These norms were established by, quote, research institutes, end quote. These norms' application on the land required the participation of a growing number of brigadiers and supervisors. It also required an enlargement of the accounting establishment of the kolkhozes. The norms applied in the different kolkhozes were theoretically, quote, adapted to local conditions, end quote. In practice, this was far from being the case. The pressures of all kinds were exercised on the way in which the norms were, quote, adapted, end quote, and, quote, applied, end quote. Footnote. See H. Ronsky, Remuneration, pages 228 and 32. End footnote. The extension of this system did not give the kolkhoznik the advantage of a fixed wage. All the same, it did impose a, quote, discipline of work, end quote, analogous to that which stemmed from the, quote, wage per piece, end quote, which according to Marx is, quote, the form of wage most suited to the capitalist mode of production, end quote. That is, the most adequate for capitalist control of the labor force and surplus value. The discrimination suffered by the kolkhozniks, parenthesis, and the contradictions of the kolkhoz system, in parenthesis, manifested themselves here in the circumstance that the system tended to impose on the kolkhoznik a form of exploitation which was capitalist, even though they were not wage earners. Footnote. See Marx's Capital, Volume 2. End footnote. The discrimination which affected kolkhozniks also manifested itself in the circumstance that the kolkhozniks were excluded from labor legislation on the pretext that the kolkhozniks were classed as, quote, cooperative workers, end quote. Theoretically, the decisions taken by the kolkhoz administration could be revoked by the General Assembly of Kolkhozniks. In reality, they could not be. The courts did not interfere in the internal affairs of the kolkhoz. The kolkhoz's management functioned like a, quote, court of first instance, end quote. It even took decisions that frequently violated the ordinary laws, including decisions having a penal character, for it was not subordinated to any, quote, judicial control, end quote. Therefore, so far as the kolkhozniks were concerned, it was both judge and interested party, just as the feudal lord had been. Footnote. From the 1960s, the, quote, exceptional situation that the kolkhozniks occupied since the 1930s gave rise to critical, more or less official discussion. In fact, it was a cause of conflicts and harmful to production. Thus, in the publications of these years, there were many articles devoted to this exceptional situation. These critical commentaries about the past prepared and accompanied the partial reform of the kolkhoz system undertaken by Khrushchev and continued by Brezhnev. End footnote. The workers of the, quote, collective farm could not contest in the courts the evaluation by kolkhoz management organs of the way in which they had fulfilled the work norm. The courts could only intervene to require the kolkhoz management to pay a kolkhoznik a sum which was due to the kolkhoznik by virtue of a decision already taken by the kolkhoz. The courts could only intervene to require the kolkhoz management to pay a kolkhoznik a sum which was due to that kolkhoznik by virtue of a decision already taken by the kolkhoz. The discriminatory situation in which the kolkhozniks found themselves placed included numerous other aspects. The kolkhozniks could not be unionized, because the kolkhozniks were not wage earners. The kolkhozniks had no rights to social security, for the same reason, The kolkhozniks received no state aid for housing. The kolkhozniks were liable for various obligatory works, for the upkeep of roads, for example, which did not burden other citizens. The price of merchandise sold in the kolkhozes was higher than in the towns. Finally, and above all, the kolkhozniks had no right to a fixed wage. Because the income which was distributed to the kolkhozniks by the kolkhoz was a, quote, balance, that, quote, what remained, quote, for distribution, end quote, after the kolkhoz had allocated the kolkhoz's resources to all kinds of uses imposed by the state, beginning with the procurements and compulsory deliveries which went to the state and had absolute priority. Above all, the kolkhozniks had no right to a fixed wage because the income which was distributed to the kolkhozniks was a, quote, balance, what, quote, remained for distribution, end quote, after the kolkhoz had allocated the kolkhoz's resources to all kinds of uses imposed by the state, beginning with the procurements and the compulsory deliveries which went to the state and had absolute priority. In addition, Without being able to appeal to the courts, in parentheses, the kolkhozniks could be subjected to fines by the kolkhoz management and have to pay, quote, indemnities, end quote, for damage the kolkhozniks might have caused. The amount of these damage payments was, moreover, calculated by the kolkhoz management. In sum, the derisory, quote, remuneration, end quote, which came to the kolkhoznik for his work in the, quote, collective economy, end quote, and the uncertain nature of the kolkhoznik's, quote, remuneration, end quote, had as a consequence the fact that the kolkhoznik's work constituted forced labor analogous to the corvée, the barshchina, once owed to the feudal seigneur. I can never pronounce that word right. Signor. Never feel confident in it. But I'm going to look up what the hell is a barshchina. It's just like a refers to unpaid labor in Russia. Quote, barshchina. This is the AI overview. It says in Russia, quote, barshchina, end quote, refers to the unpaid labor or corvée owed by a serf to their landlord, typically involving work on the landlord's land. It was a common form of obligation alongside the payment of taxes, parenthesis, obrok, and parenthesis. Barshchina was a significant part of the serfdom system in Russia, where serfs were legally bound to the land and required to provide labor or payments to their lords. And back to the text. Moreover, it is significant that it became necessary to fix for kolkhozniks a definite number of compulsory work days to be contributed to the, quote, collective economy, because the majority did their work in the kolkhoz with great reluctance and preferred to devote themselves to their, quote, individual holdings, end quote, a circumstance about which the Soviet leaders often complained. Footnote. For example, see the reports on agriculture at the 17th and 18th Congresses of the party. End footnote. In January 1934, at the 17th Congress of the party, Andreev, parenthesis, entrusted with agricultural problems in the Central Committee, end parenthesis, acknowledged that some kolkhozniks refused to work regularly on the, quote, collective, end quote, land. At first, these refusals led to sanctions imposed by the kolkhoz chairman. In May and November 1939, regulatory action was taken by the government to impose rather more strictly a, quote, obligation to work, end quote, on the kolkhozniks. The annual minimum number of obligatory work days was then fixed between 60 and 100 days per year. In 1942, this minimum number was fixed at 100 to 150 days per year, parenthesis, order of April 17th, 1942, end parenthesis. This Andreev is referring to Andreev. It's a hilarious name. Who lived from 1895 to 1971. He was a Soviet communist politician, an old Bolshevik who rose to power during the rule of Joseph Stalin joining the Politburo as a candidate member in 1926 and as a full member in 1932. Andreev also headed the powerful Central Control Commission of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1930 to 1931, and then again from 1939 until 1952. In 1952, Andreev was removed from the Politburo and placed in a largely ceremonial position as a member of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Back to the text. New section. New heading. Heading 2. Quasi-state serfdom. In total, the mass of immediate producers who had been placed in the, quote, collective economy, end quote, were in a situation resembling that of state serfs, subject to obligatory labor, to arbitrary decisions by those who managed the kolkhozes, and were only exceptionally able to appeal to the juridical organs, the judicial organs. Moreover, they were forbidden in practice to quit their kolkhoz. They were really attached to the kolkhoz like the middle-aged peasant had been attached to the soil, or the serf to the lord's land. The ban on a kolkhoznik leaving the kolkhoz, unless he had permission from the authorities, which is also the case for serfs, took the Russian peasant back not only to before October, but even to before the Stolypin reform, which had abolished the exceptional status of peasants, and still worse, to before the law of February 19th, March 3rd, 1861, which, with many delays and limitations, freed the peasants from serfdom, made the peasants, quote, free, and removed the peasants from the law of the police and the justice of the landlord. Footnote. This was the ukaz of October 5/18, 1906. This should not be confused with the ukaz, which is like a decree, of November 9/22, 1906, which aimed at transforming collective peasant property into individual peasant property. This ukaz attacked the mir and relied on the, quote, strong peasants, whom it aimed to make into a class of kulaks while turning their attention away from the nobility's land. End footnote. It's very interesting. This backward step resulted from no law but from the kolkhoz statutes, which did not allow the kolkhoznik to leave permanently his residence and his place of work, except after obtaining the permission of the, quote, kolkhoz, which meant in reality the kolkhoz management. Admittedly, the kolkhoz statutes indicated that the kolkhoznik, quote, could leave the, quote, the kolkhoz, end quote, but as they did not specify in what conditions he could make use of this, quote, right, the latter depended in practice on the, quote, goodwill, end quote, of the kolkhoz authorities, on the judgment that they made about the effects of a departure, on the sympathy or antipathy that the managers of the kolkhoz felt toward the applicant, the, quote, strings, end quote, he could pull among these, quote, superior, end quote, authorities and local custom, which could always be revoked, in parentheses. The need to obtain this permission in order to quit the kolkhoz was retained up to the 1970s. In the words of the Soviet peasant, this permission, which from 1932 enabled an internal passport to be obtained, in parentheses, was commonly described by the term, quote, letter of emancipation, end quote, which at the time of serfdom was the name of the document given to the peasants by the landlord who freed them. It is typical that the project statute of the kolkhoz, it's probably statute, no, it says statute, but I think it's probably statute. It is typical that the project statute of the kolkhoz gave heavy treatment to the formalities of exclusion. the formalities of exclusion from the kolkhoz, but specified nothing, and for good reason, about the, quote, rights of departure, end quote. Footnote: on these different points, which were current problems for most of the 1960s, see for example, G. Chubakov, e.g. August 4th, 1965, page 30, and various remarks and references in K.E. Vatikan's Führungskraft, or Führungskraft. End footnote. Soviet authors who have studied these questions show that even when a kolkhoz woman married a town dweller, she had to, quote, obtain the right to leave, end quote, from the kolkhoz management. Footnote: the verb often used in popular talk, ostpustit, parenthesis, to set at liberty, was that used in feudal law. End footnote. Similarly, a kolkhoznik whose daughter married in the town could not, in that kolkhoznik's turn, go and live with her without being so authorized. In general, permission to leave was not granted, parenthesis, and this was not a, quote, right, end quote, end parenthesis, except when the kolkhoznik had obtained a contract with another enterprise and accommodation. Footnote: see various references in K.E. Vatikan Führungskraft, page 47. End footnote. A kolkhoznik might possibly abandon the kolkhoz. That kolkhoznik would then be expelled. That kolkhoznik would lose his house. That kolkhoznik's expulsion was written into documents, which put the kolkhoznik in a precarious and dangerous situation. People then said that the kolkhoznik had obtained his, quote, volchi bilet, end quote, parenthesis, a personal identification document of Tsarist times, which carried details of the bearer's political unreliability, end parenthesis. That kolkhoznik was no longer a kolkhoznik or worker or employee, being regarded as a, quote, individual peasant, end quote, and liable to high taxes. He was in fact directly threatened by various repressive measures. During the 1930s, this did not prevent many kolkhozniks leaving in this way. At first, these kolkhozniks worked occasionally, sleeping in railway stations or in huts, and they moved around without being, quote, registered at the police station. Some were eventually arrested for, quote, vagrancy, while others ended up finding a regular job and accommodation. Footnote: during most of the first 5-year plan, the management of the kolkhozes was so defective, and the need of industry for workers so great that millions of peasants and kolkhozniks left for the towns, without any control being put on them. Things changed after 1932 to 33. Henceforth, the possibility of a kolkhoznik leaving his village was much more restricted. The kolkhoz statutes were applied more rigorously. Otherwise, the overexploitation of the kolkhozniks would have led to a mass exodus and a worsening of the agricultural situation. End footnote. The difficulties of those who left without being officially, quote, freed, end quote, were all the greater because they possessed neither the, quote, internal passport, end quote, which was usually required, nor the, quote, workbook, end quote. These two, quote, documents, end quote, were distributed to city dwellers during the 1930s, but were not given to the peasants. The introduction of the, quote, internal passport, end quote, also restored a feature of Tsarism abolished by the October Revolution. The Tsarist regime likewise had denied peasants an internal passport. It should be emphasized that it was not only the active kolkhoznik who was attached to the soil. This attachment extended in reality to the members of his family, although in principle, quote, membership, end quote, of the kolkhoz was, quote, individual, end quote, and, quote, voluntary, end quote. In practice, at the end of the 1930s, members of a kolkhoznik family were, quote, automatically, end quote, entered on the list of kolkhozniks. This practice continued after the war despite the protests of certain kolkhozniks who wanted their children to be attached to the kolkhoz only at their personal request. These protests by kolkhozniks were usually rejected, in spite of the legal texts by the collective farm chairman who kept a register of kolkhoznik households analogous to the, quote, register of souls, end quote, which was kept before the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Footnote. On this point, see the article by G. Shinakova and A. Yanov, 1976, something in Russian. And footnote. The attachment of the kolkhozniks to the soil put the kolkhozniks in a situation of total subordination to the organs of the kolkhoz management, and it had an effect on the conditions under which the kolkhozniks worked and were remunerated. Although the management of the kolkhoz could act at its own discretion in relations with its kolkhozniks, the same could not be said about the management of the kolkhoz's relations with superior bodies. For example, industrial enterprises which wanted to recruit manpower in the countryside could be authorized by the appropriate central offices to make agreement with kolkhoz managers. Footnote. This recruiting procedure with Orgnabor, organized recruitment, was viewed with favor by the party and government leadership. End footnote. These managers usually did not wish to deprive of labor power. These managers usually did not wish to be deprived of labor power, but it was difficult for them to escape from, quote, organized recruitment, end quote, when the industrial enterprises were, quote, supported, end quote, by the higher authorities. It sometimes happened that the collective farm managers demanded that, quote, their, end quote, kolkhoz be compensated for the, quote, loss of manpower, end quote, which was imposed on them in this way. This, quote, compensation, end quote, was levied on the wages of the kolkhozniks sent to work in industry. Popularly, this levy was described by the term obrok, which evoked the dues that the serf had to pay to his landowner when the latter allowed him to leave for the town. The AI overview on Google says in Russia, obrok refers to a type of rent or a quit rent, specifically a fixed cash payment or payment in kind, like produce or livestock, that serfs are required to make to their landlord instead of performing corvée labor, barshchina, It was a form of obligation for serfs who were not required to work directly on the landlord's estate, but instead paid a fee for the land they worked on. Obrok was a common form of serf obligation in the central Black Earth region of Russia, where a significant portion of the serf population opted for this payment method instead of corvée labor. Back to the text. In sum, during the 1930s, millions of peasants nevertheless left the countryside because those peasants took advantage of the disorganization in the early days, or those peasants had been excluded or ejected from the kolkhoz, or those peasants had taken their, quote, volchi bilet, end quote, or they had been recruited in the framework of the Orgnabor For the tens of millions who remained, quote, attached, end quote, to their kolkhoz, this obviously did not change the situation of the quasi-state serfdom in which they found themselves. New heading. Some remarks about the return to forms of quasi-serfdom during the 1930s. Marx observed that, quote, the tradition of all past generations weighs like an Alp upon the brain of the living. ... A whole people that imagines it was imparted to itself, that it has imparted to itself accelerated powers of motion through a revolution, suddenly finds itself transferred back to a dead epoch, and there turn up again the old calendars, the old names, the old edicts, ... End quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire of the Wee Bonaparte. In a certain way, this is what happened to the Soviet peasants during the 1930s. The peasants' new masters rediscovered the old instruments of coercion. They dressed them in new words, but the peasants were not deceived and gave them their old names. But it should be emphasized that the return to the relationships of dependence and exploitation, reminiscent of the relationship appropriate to serfdom, in no way indicates that this return was purely and simply to the old social relationships and the old class relationships. In particular, 3 points must be kept in view. 1. The kolkhoz was neither a, quote, lord's domain, end quote, nor a large landed property. What the kolkhoz produced and the use made of what the kolkhoz produced were determined by the requirements of accumulation at the scale of society. Accumulation at the scale of society. Requirements which were mediated by the party and by the state. Also, the existence of relationships like those of serfdom, which typified the kolkhoz, does not mean that the kolkhozniks escaped capitalist exploitation. These relationships indicate that such exploitation bore on them in a, quote, specific form, end quote. Such a situation is not exceptional. The, quote, independent peasants, end quote, of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalist countries are likewise subject, under specific forms, to the exploitation of capital. It was the same in the 19th century for slaves on the plantations in the American southern states or in Cuba, and still today, for example, for the Haitian immigrants to the Dominican Republic, where they are, quote, attached, end quote, to their exploiters by debts that they are unable to repay. 2. The work process within the kolkhoz was mainly a repetition, parenthesis, even a caricature, end parenthesis, of the capitalist work process, with its forms of division and hierarchies. It tended to concentrate at one pole what Marx called the, quote, intellectual forces of production, end quote, parenthesis, even though the intellectual forces of production were extremely weak, end parenthesis, and to deprive the ordinary worker of any initiative. The work process even tended to expropriate from the old peasants knowledge and experience. Aided by the general indifference to work, the work process aided by general indifference to work, it succeeded quite well. The peasant's rich experience, already dilapidated, was replaced only by the unreliable knowledge of, quote, experts, end quote. The results are still visible today. 3. In the social structure as a whole, the kolkhoz managers in no way occupied the same place as the landowners or feudal lords. They were appointed and dismissed by political chiefs placed above them, and they were responsible to the latter for the achievement of a certain number of tasks. In fact, they were subordinate agents of society-scale tasks connected with the extraction of surplus labor and the accumulation of surplus value. That's the end of section 2 of chapter 3 of Charles Bettelheim's class struggle in the USSR, part 3, third period, 1930 to 1941. The dominated. Chapter 3 is titled The Kolkhoz System. And this section was called, what's this section called? The kolkhoz. Thank you so much for listening. The next section is titled if you're interested. I mean, I think you can get value out of just listening to one of these. The kolkhoz managerial stratum and its place in the general social structure. Thank you so much for listening.